Hey friends, welcome back to the Uncommodified podcast and to another UNCORK conversation, my favorite kind of conversations. Today my guest once again is my great friend Amanda Macdougall. Amanda, welcome back to the show.
Hey Tim, good
This
to
is
be
like
back.
every day at the office, or sort of when we go to for coffee when we're planning things, but it's a little different, a little bit more formal. Well, maybe not so formal because it's an UNCORK conversation, and that means we don't have to have coffee because it's not 10 a.m. It is evening time, so we can
That's true.
drink something that big boys and big girls drink. What are you drinking tonight,
That's right.
Amanda?
Well, tonight, Tim, I actually am finishing off a bottle of 20-year-old Taylor Fladgate
Yes.
port, the celebratory bottle that I had, and this is the end
Oh,
of
what
it.
was the celebration that was bought for?
It was it was for us
I
working
know.
together, act- to start
Yeah, it
our
was. It was.
partnership.
And you know what? Man, I do you better than I do myself because you got a 20-year-old port and I have a lowly 10-year-old port. But also, also a very good port. And I am going to pour myself a drink. And cheers to you, Amanda.
Cheers, Tim.
Oh, we're officially like old people. We're sipping port. Why we podcast? It sounds so uppity. We're just sipping port.
We should be in the
Yes,
smoking
well, I
room.
was in the smoking room earlier, but that smoking room is in my backyard. Don't tell my wife, she's gone tonight. So, surprise, Pam, surprise. Anyways, let's get back to things. So, here's what we're going to do tonight in this conversation. It'll be a little bit different. We're going to bring you as a listener into our crazy world that Amanda and I work in when we sit down, and sometimes we sit down and have a drink together, like a glass of wine, or sometimes we sit down and we have a coffee and we chitty chat and we bounce ideas back and forth and we push and pull on them and we stretch them and then we try to figure out how we're going to communicate certain things to our clients. So we're letting you behind the curtain tonight, as it were, into the crazy conversations that we have when we're exploring an idea, when we're brailing it out and touching it and try to get our hands around it. So I'll let me introduce the topic to our listeners tonight, Amanda. It's a provocative idea that you and I have been talking about for a while and seeing how this works out in the worlds that we work in. But here's the question we want you to think about as we start tonight. And again, if you're a business leader, if you're an organizational leader, or you just exist in an organization or a business, this conversation would be for you. And even if you don't, you might find it helpful in relationship to how you deal with certain things in your life that come up. So the provocative idea that we want to push and pull on in this conversation is this. What if when things do not go as well as you planned, of course, that never happens, but what if something doesn't go as well as you planned in your organization? What if you came around the problem that you're experiencing instead of coming around and blaming people? So, what if you came around the problem instead of coming around and blaming people as our immediate response, which sometimes happen? And what if as a result of that, we actually saw our people more like capital assets in our business as opposed to disposable assets? What if that was part of the psyche that we chose to look at these things through? So, Amanda, when we push and pull on this idea, first of all, why is this an interesting conversation to you?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I see it happen so often in others and in myself, right? When something goes wrong or you hear from somebody that something's gone off the rails, the first instinct that we often have is whose
Mm,
fault is it, right? We set out to find the fault and the blame in the problem rather than going, here's the problem, who can I find to come around this and help me solve it? And we spend so much energy trying to figure that out. And really, that's not solving the problem. When we're trying to find who's at fault and who's to blame, we're not
mm,
solving the problem. And yet we fall into the trap. I fall into the trap of doing that as my knee jerk reaction if I'm not careful.
interesting. So, I just heard you say something interesting, and this is, by the way, this is sort of how we riff on one another when we're creating content. We have these discussions, and then we come up with these sort of ways of looking at it. So, what I'm hearing you say very quickly is we want to, instead of finding the who, what we want to do is we want to, and finding the fault, we want to find the source of the problem. So we want to make our quest different. Instead of questing to figure out who did it, we want to find out what the core problem is and how the who's can come together to solve it, is really what I hear you saying.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and Tim, how I think this relates to disposable assets versus capital assets is, I think when we go to who's the
Mm-hmm.
problem, we're actually looking to blame someone, and we're looking to not care for that person really in the moment. In the moment, it's not about caring for the person, it's about finding the
Mm.
person to blame. And when you think about the concept of assets, disposable assets, when they break or they aren't doing what you want them to do or they've lost their usefulness, you
Mm.
throw them out. You get rid of them. That's why they're called disposable, right? And so we often unintentionally just do that. We treat our people, even though we say
Mm.
we don't, but in some of our actions, we treat our people like they are the disposable asset.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And again, and we're all guilty of this. I mean, again, we're not above this, as you already said, Amanda, and I'm guilty of it. I mean,
yeah.
recently we had a situation that you and I were chatting about. I wasn't very happy about something. I'm not gonna go into what it was, but I wasn't very happy about it, and I had a little bit of a hissy fit, a little bit of a pissy fit on the way home from someplace as we were driving home, and that wasn't my best moment. And that, listen, I'm human. We're all human, and sometimes we give in to the less than better ways of looking at things. And that conversation was full of my angst around an individual, not necessarily my frustration with the problem. And of course, Amanda, being the
Mhm.
great person that she is, she listened very dutifully to me rant and rave. And then she very kindly redirected my thinking around the problem and the solution, as opposed to the person and my frustration. So, well played, Amanda. Well played. I will drink to that, by the way.
Another
Hmm.
opportunity, right?
I drink to that. It was well played. You can see how that works out. So what are some of the strategies that we could employ that would help us recalibrate ourselves on this thinking about how we move to blame and the who done it, as opposed to moving
Yeah.
towards the problem solving?
Right. Well, I think one is acknowledging that
Mm.
that's where you're going and asking yourself, am I asking myself the right questions? I think that's the first thing. I think if we follow the analogy of, not thinking about your team, your employees as disposable, and we look at them instead as capital assets, we treat our capital assets
Mm.
much differently, right? It's a given that our building, let's
Yeah.
say if you own a building and you have a company, it's the building you have. So you work with the building, right, in order to deliver what product you're trying to create, whatever your business is. And you might have to do some renovations. You for sure have to do maintenance in terms of putting into the building so it continues to be useful, as part of your business. Um, and so, how do we take that analogy and think about it in terms of our teams? How are we in the moment of a problem really stopping and saying, what resources do I have? How can I use the assets that I have? They are what I have. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to get rid of them to come around this problem. What can I find that I actually appreciate in the moment? What are the good things? Because we find what
Mm.
we're looking for, right? If you want to move out of somewhere, you find everything wrong with the home you're living in. But if you want to stay, you find everything you love about it. And so in that moment, asking yourself, am I looking for solutions? And am I appreciating the resources that I have available to
Mm.
me? And am I using them to the best ability? And sometimes that means asking questions instead of making assumptions. Can you help me understand what's going on here? Can you give me some insight what your perspective is? A lot of asking questions instead of jumping to
Mm. No,
assumptions. What other ideas do you
well,
have, Tim?
first of all, I think that what you just said is brilliant in the sense that, again, jumping to conclusions will always cause you a problem. Remaining curious and asking better questions is always going to put you in a better place. The assumptions we make, particularly when we're frustrated with problems, will kill us. But I think the other thing that I think of as you're talking about this is, and I love the analogy, if you have a building that's an asset and it's problematic, you don't just decide tomorrow you're going to burn it down and get a new one, because it's impractical. You can't do that. You need budget to do it. You need a plan. But as you said, we can fall into that with our people at times. And maybe that's just the core of this thing when you think about it. I mean, our assets are something we use to go to war with, to fight with, to go into business with, to take our organizations forward. They are fundamentally our allies, hopefully, in what we're doing. And this brings up the point, I think, sometimes is that when we get polarized around this problem, and particularly when people become the problem and we see them at the epicenter of it, is that we become enemies, not allies. So we're no longer allies
Mm.
around a table having a discussion. I think of, oftentimes when I think of the word ally, I think of those old war movies where you had these scenes where, generals were in these rooms, and in the olden days, they had these big maps out on these tables and they were plotting what they were going to do. And they were coming around sometimes with different members or different nations, and they were planning and strategizing. I think of this when I think of Winston Churchill and other nations back in the war. And they came around these tables, around the problem that they were trying to solve as allies around this map in relationship to what can we do? What resources do we have? What is the problem? How are we going to solve it? Obviously, enemies never come around that table to plan. The
Mm.
enemy is not in that room. The enemy is outside. It's who we're warring against. And so the good question I think we need to all ask ourselves is, at times, are we treating people, our own people, as enemies and not as allies in the war that we're going to battle for, the what we're trying to accomplish, whether it's a business or an organization, and remaining allies in the midst of difficulties, which then brings up the conversation, and we've talked about this before, is again having those difficult conversations that do confront the problem and do solve the problem and do name the problem and call it a problem. I think that's part of it. And sometimes we call these things challenges and opportunities and issues. No, this is a big ass problem. And being able to call it a problem and then depersonalizing that problem to the point where we're not going at each other's throats as the epicenter of that problem. That's ultimately what we're talking about. And as you're listening, I would just challenge you and ask yourself, do you have a problem in your home? Do you have a problem in your life? Do you have a problem in your business, your organization, where frankly you're starting to become enemies with the people you ought to be allies with? And that actually diminishes your power, because now you're going to battle alone. You're not going to battle with a team anymore when you take that propositional argument. And I think we've seen this a little bit work out recently, even in our own country. And recently, I mean, we're recording this episode in late September, late September. I don't know exactly when it'll air, but we've recently had a situation on a national level that maybe is an example, maybe, of this.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened with Lisa LaFlamme. When you look at that, and she's an anchor on one of our national news, CTV News. For those of you who don't know, not in Canada, it's a major news network. How do you see the potential that that's an example of what we're talking about?
So it's interesting because you and I were talking about this briefly, in that there was a problem. Ratings were sliding for whatever reason, but somebody determined somewhere that the problem
Yeah,
was the person, and all that needed to happen was to
yeah,
change the anchor. And ultimately, that cost CTV a lot in terms of reputational risk and a number of other things, because they could have engaged a lot of people around whatever the problem was that could have been causing ratings. And let's say that it was, for argument's sake, the fact that Lisa decided to have her hair turn gray, which is what's become the flashpoint in that issue. Um, there's a conversation to be had rather than just treating the anchor like it's a disposable person who we can just switch out. Because the reality is, I saw a study actually earlier this week that I'm not sure if they've done a similar study in Canada at this point, Tim, but in the US Bureau of Labor did a study. And in the US, between April 2021 and April 2022, 71.6 million people left their jobs. So they quit. They moved, and they're doing research now as to what's really driving that. But some of the themes that are coming out under that are that people want to feel like they are part of the something, right? Part of something, that their job has a purpose, that they matter, that they're not just a disposable asset. And so if you have that many million people that are leaving, if they're not brought in to help be part of the solution and they're simply treated like they don't matter, you are adding to your own
Mm,
staffing
mm,
crisis. And it's not easy to replace people like it maybe was when we had unemployment rates that were a lot higher. So there's actually a business imperative here as well, right? Not only is it just good leadership to have allies and bring them around you and to empower those that are on your team and treat them like they have value, but it's very costly to find replacements. They're maybe not as disposable as you
yeah,
think they
no,
are.
and that's a good point. And the other thing that I think of as you talk about that is that when we look at this issue and how people tend to think of these things, the reality is that people get sort of muddled up at times in that they see a similar thing happening in multiple places, maybe in their business, or frankly, they might experience even the same problem with multiple people. And what they fail to do, and I see this a lot when I coach people, it's like, somebody's had the same problem with four different people, and somehow the penny hasn't dropped yet that the only common denominator in all those relationships is them. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
so easy to personify the problem outside of yourself. And it's like all four of those people were bad. They were the problem. But the only common denominator in all four situations was the one person. And so you got to ask some better questions of yourself, because sometimes we're not throwing water on that fire. We're throwing gasoline on it. We're a co-contributor to that problem. And understanding and owning our part of that, because at the end of the day, I mean, people are part of the problem at some level. But if we move to that blame, first of all, we are going to have a very negative disposition. So if we can hold the tension that
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about here, where we can actually talk about the problem and we can take it outside of ourselves, sort of put it on the table, as it were, and look at it from
Yeah.
multiple angles, and then ask, what is our part in that? Well, what part do we have to play in that? And understanding that, again, if people aren't disposable in the process, then how do we work with them? At the same time, there are times in which you do need an ending with somebody. The reality is, at times, we're going to need an ending, and something's going to have to change. But if that's our default mechanism that we go to, that, oh, this must be the wrong person, and you've seen this, Amanda. It's like people. And if somebody comes in for an interview and, oh, this is the most amazing person we've ever seen. They're so amazing. They're going to be so amazing. And then 6 months later, everybody's shitting all over them. Like somehow they had a heart and brain and everything else transplant, and now they're a piece of crap. Well, what happened in 6 months? Maybe the fact is they hung around with me too long, and they that now that maybe that's their problem. But the reality is we have to understand that this is a complex thing, and if we're going to villainize people along the way, it never goes well for us.
No, and I mean, you've highlighted just the stages in relationships, right? You think back to if you've ever dated anyone, right? In the beginning, it's wonderful. There's nothing that person can do that's wrong. Everything is about passion and it's great, right? And at some point, if that relationship goes deeper, you start to find out, oh, maybe that person's not perfect, right? And at that, a lot of relationships end at that point. But if you're willing to push past the fact that people have flaws, which, oh my goodness, everyone does, and be able to accept that there are strengths in a person and deficiencies, right? Like challenges that some people have, it makes it much easier to work with people to solve problems. Because if you're expecting that the honeymoon phase is going to last for 20 years, you're probably delusional.
Whoa, 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 whoa,
Right?
whoa! Wait now. I have been married to the most wonderful woman ever, the Mrs. Windsor, for 36 years now, and it has been a honeymoon for 36 years, and she will tell you.
You tell
Whoa,
yourself
whoa,
that,
whoa!
Tim.
No. I believe it, and therefore it's true, Amanda. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, you know what? This also brings up another point, and this is again the disingenuous nature, maybe, of people at time and leaders. How often have we heard people say, or they put it on their website or something? People are our greatest asset. People are our greatest asset, and then right behind that comes it. Our internal people are customers. Really? That's all. Come on, seriously? That can be a lot of bullshit and butterflies. I mean, people are our greatest asset, but you know what? they're always the source of the problem. So we just slash and burn them. But we don't do that to our buildings, which is the greatest asset. Oh, maybe it's not the greatest asset. And then we have this idea, and we hear this. Oh, we treat our internal people like they're customers. They're customers, and I think, really, I don't think you'd ever do that to your customer, or you wouldn't have a business. So maybe part of this thing is that leaders and people of influence in organizations and businesses ought to stop lying to themselves about this idea that people are our greatest asset and we treat them like customers, when the reality is maybe we don't do that as much as we think we do at times.
Right. You know, I in my coaching sessions, I will often have conversations with leaders about whether or not they're actually living out the values that they
Mm,
say they have, and spend some time really getting them to actually verbalize, well, what do you value? And maybe in cases like what we're talking about today, when you're having a challenge with a problem that is related or not related to a specific person on your team, is really asking yourself, what do I value in not only them as a person, right? Starting there with the positive side of things, but also what are my values in how I want to show up in resolving this
mm,
problem?
mm.
And if we asked ourselves that question more often, I think people genuinely want to treat others like they
Yes.
have value. They want to 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 have people be their greatest asset. That's why it's on the wall. But we have to ask ourselves really hard questions about, are our actions actually aligning with what we
Mm.
say we value?
So again, we're just having this conversation a little bit different in this podcast, just having a conversation as we would across a table in a restaurant if we were thinking through something to train with. And the one thing I would say is that if you and I were sitting down having this conversation and we were saying, how would we communicate this to a customer, maybe in a session? I think what comes to me is I think this building analogy is really powerful in that, when you think of your capital assets, when you've got something sticky with your warehouse facility, you don't raise it to the ground with fire. You hire a consultant, you ask questions, you get to the bottom of what's happening, of why it isn't as efficient as it should be. You jerry rig a solution for a season, you figure it out, and then you create a budget and you invest, and then you revitalize the facility and you move on because it's a capital asset. So I really
Mm-hmm.
think if we were taking all of this and wrapping it into some kind of training session, I can see a beautiful graphic on the screen of a beautiful building, and then a picture of a person, and the question would be, do you see these two assets the same? That's
Ah,
visually how I see it, because when you use a building analogy, it just makes sense. I mean, how many people out there? How many of you who work at an office or a building, or you're a business owner, or you're a leader, or you're a manager, and you go, man, if this was my office, I would have done this. This is terrible. This is a terrible design. You got to bring in the ergonomist and figure it out. It's just terrible. Well, but you learn to live with it and you figure it out. And you pull up your bootstraps and you do what's got to be done because that's just the way it is. And every once in a while, you get rid of the dusty rose paint, you put something different on it, it looks beautiful, and maybe you do a full scale renovation. But renovations are hard. They're tough. They cost a lot of money and they interrupt productivity and all the other stuff. But again, what if we believed enough in our people that every once in a while you need to invest in them and help them renovate themselves? There's a lot of
yeah.
employees out there that are good people, good meaning people, but frankly, they're just a little dusty. They need to go back to school a little bit. They got to learn a few new things. They need a different coat of paint. Maybe they need a little renovation. They need an investment in them of new skills and new understanding to move into the new world. And maybe that's the way business leaders ought to look at the opportunity with their people, particularly, as you said, in a market that is very difficult to replace people.
Hmm. Yeah. You know what? I think that's a cheers, Tim. You just summarized the whole like thought process in a
I
graphic on
like
a
that. And for
PowerPoint.
those of you, by the way, who are watching by a video, you can see we are raising our glass of port, which is a snooty drink, but quite nice, to one another as we chat tonight. So again, a little different conversation. We won't go quite as long as we normally do, but just want you to think about these things. Amanda actually had sent me an email maybe a couple months ago about this idea as a topic, and it's a brilliant idea, Amanda, because we're all susceptible to this problem. We're all susceptible to putting blame on people instead of taking responsibility ourselves. We're all susceptible to not taking the problem and taking it outside of people and sort of trying to see it inside of them and vilify them at times. I know that I struggle with this. I think every human does at any level, and so it's a great conversation. And so, what I would say to you is that if you're listening for a reason. And if you're in a place of influence, ask yourself what this conversation means to you. If you're a member of an organization or a company, ask yourself what this means to you. Because, by the way, just because you're not a leader doesn't mean you're not susceptible to this. A lot of times, if you work in an organization or a company, you look at your leaders and you see them as the problem. Then they might look at you and see you as the problem. And so maybe, again, we need to come around that table like generals and allies did in the war and ask ourselves, who is our common enemy? What is the common enemy we're trying to kill or to solve, which in this case would be the problem? And how do we get that problem outside of people and ask ourselves a subset of better questions? Questions that would allow us to understand that this problem could be co-owned by everybody. And in fact, the problem probably exists in everyone at some level. This is our encouragement to you. Next time you are apt to not behave well, like I didn't in the car ride on the way home, maybe you too will have an Amanda sitting beside you who will calm you down, center you, and ask you a series of better questions and ask you to be your better self, just like Amanda did. Thanks again. Cheers to you, and thanks for listening.